In the year 1700, India wasn't just wealthy, it was an economic giant. Nearly 1/4 of the world's total wealth came from the subcontinent. It was the center of global trade, a land overflowing with gold, fine textiles, rare spices, and master craftsmanship. Indian cottons, silks, and jewels traveled across continents, admired from Arabia to Europe. Its cities were alive with artisans, merchants, and bustling markets. Bengal, by itself, produced more wealth than all of Britain. But by 1947, when India gained independence, its share of the world economy had crashed to under 4%. That wealth didn't disappear. It was taken quietly, methodically, not simply by force, but by taxes, trade policies, and financial manipulation. Over 200 years, Britain built one of the most calculated extraction machines in world history. It didn't just rule India, it profited from it. India, once a producer of luxury goods sought by the whole world, was transformed into a supplier of cheap raw materials for British factories. And the transformation happened through accounting, through ledgers, contracts, and financial rules. This isn't a story about nationalism. It's a story about numbers, how one of Earth's richest civilizations became impoverished through design, through accident. To understand how it happened, we go back to the beginning. Long before India came under British control, the Mughal Empire governed a vast and sophisticated land of nearly 150 million people, about a quarter of the planet's population. The empire thrived on agriculture, irrigation, thriving ports, and world-famous craftsmanship. European traders traveled for months just to buy Indian cotton, pepper, silk, and indigo. India sold high-value goods to almost everyone and bought very little in return. Gold and silver flowed into India, enriching it year after year. But across the ocean, a small island nation was rising, ambitious, organized, and guided by a brand new invention, the Joint Stock Company. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I gave a group of London merchants a charter to create the East India Company. It wasn't a government, but it would soon become one. It had shareholders, directors, and eventually its own army. At first, it was simply another trader. Portugal, France, and the Dutch were already active in India, but the British had a different strategy. Others wanted cooperation. The British wanted control. Their advantage wasn't just ships or soldiers, it was finance. Their voyages were backed by bonds, protected by insurance from Lloyd's of London, and driven by a financial network powerful enough to scale trade like no empire before them. Soon the company realized its biggest profits didn't come from trade, came from taxation. And everything changed in 1757. The Battle of Plassas Mall and Sais became one of history's biggest turning points. With fewer than 1,000 men and a few local allies, the company defeated the Nawab of Bengal. But the real victory happened afterward. The company installed a puppet leader and gave itself the right to collect Bengal's taxes. That moment marked the birth of corporate colonialism. Within just 10 years, tens of millions of pounds were flowing out of Bengal every year, so much that the region fell into inflation, economic collapse, and famine. London prospered. Calcutta suffered. Rich politicians celebrated enormous profits. Company shareholders grew instantly wealthy. Stock prices soared. Men who had never seen India made fortunes off taxes collected from starving farmers. The East India Company became something the world had never seen, a private empire with its own money, courts, and army. Executives held meetings in London's grand boardrooms, while company agents in India forced monopolies, broke local industries, and controlled trade in the name of free markets. This wasn't random plunder. It was organized extraction. In 1770, Bengal faced one of the worst famines in history. Around 10 million people died, yet company revenues increased. They kept collecting taxes. They kept exporting grain. For investors in London, it was a profitable year. For Bengal, it was devastation. British economists later justified these policies by claiming Britain was modernizing India, building railways, schools, and courts. But every improvement was designed to benefit Britain, not India. Railways moved cotton to ports, not people to opportunity. Schools created clerks, not a middle class. Courts enforced debt, not justice. Even the railways, often romanticized, were structured to guarantee British profits. Investors were promised a 5% return paid for by Indian taxpayers, no matter how poorly the railways performed. The profits traveled to London. The costs stayed in India. It was a financial vampire system, one that drained the land without spilling blood. This system became known as the drain of wealth, famously described by Indian thinker Dadabhai Naoroji in 1901. He showed how resources, labor, and capital flowed endlessly to Britain with almost nothing coming back. By the late 1800s, India was losing the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds every year, fueling Britain's industrial revolution. And historians today estimate that between 1765 and 1938, Britain extracted the present-day equivalent of $45 trillion from India, a number so massive it's difficult to comprehend. But the impact wasn't just financial. India's craftsmen, weavers, and artisans, once the envy of the world, were destroyed by policy. British goods flooded the Indian market at prices no local artisan could match. City after city, famous for weaving, collapsed by the mid-1800s. India was no longer the world's textile leader. It was merely a supplier of raw cotton for British factories. This was globalization before globalization. India became the raw material for British industry and its captive customer. Meanwhile, India's income stagnated for centuries. Famines grew more frequent. Wages fell, yet Britain continued to grow richer. This wasn't an accident. It was a business model. By the time the British Crown replaced the East India Company in 1858, the machinery of extraction remained perfectly intact. The Raj didn't need war. It had contracts. Indian revenue paid for British wars abroad, British pensions, British civil servants, even British officers posted in Africa. The costs of running the empire were paid by the colonized. India became the empire's financial engine. Indian soldiers fought from Sudan to Singapore. Their salaries came from Indian taxes. Even British infrastructure around the world was financed using Indian revenues. It was privatized profit and socialized cost refined to perfection. Every year, through a system known as home charges, India was forced to send massive payments to Britain for services. These included salaries, pensions, interest on debt, and administrative expenses. But many of these services didn't benefit India at all. It was simply money leaving the country. By the early 1900s, these transfers were over $100 million every year, worth tens of billions today. Across 2 centuries, this financial pipeline sucked out the equivalent of $45 trillion. The effects were everywhere. Shipbuilding collapsed. Ironworks declined. Forests were cut down for railway materials. Farmers were forced into cash crops like opium and indigo, leaving them vulnerable to hunger. When drought struck, millions died. Between 1876 and 1902, over 20 million Indians died in famines while grain continued to be exported abroad. Profit mattered more than lives. Perhaps the most revealing part of the system was how it set the stage for the modern world. Because even after India became independent in 1947, it inherited a shattered economy, devastated industries, and widespread poverty. And the global system India entered was built on the same logic the empire had used. Countries exporting raw goods, importing finished goods, and taking loans to survive. Its colonial extraction simply evolved into debt extraction. Today, the mechanism has new names: structural adjustment, foreign investment, interest payments, but the direction remains the same. Wealth flows from poorer nations to richer ones. Every year, developing countries send over $200 billion more in interest and profits to wealthy nations than they receive in aid. The empire vanished, but the spreadsheets didn't. The blueprint of empire became the foundation of modern global capitalism. Empires no longer rely on armies, they rely on contracts, not on conquest, but compliance. India's story is proof, 'cause what Britain built wasn't just colonial rule. It was the first version of the modern global economy, where value moves quietly upward through systems of trade, credit, and taxation. The Raj was the first free market experiment, but only one side was free. And even today, our financial world is built on roots originally carved for extraction. Keys, ships that once carried spices now carry capital. Keys, banks that once funded conquest now fund development, and profits still move in one direction. Key, yet India survived. Despite centuries of extraction, poverty, and exploitation, India rebuilt itself. Through nationalization, reforms, and persistence, the country began to recover, not with vengeance, but with reinvention. Today, India is among the fastest growing economies on earth, but the scars remain. The global wealth gap still mirrors colonial lines. It raises a question we still struggle with. If a system rewards extraction more than creation, can it ever truly be fair? Britain didn't conquer India with soldiers alone. They conquered it with spreadsheets and accountants. And the ledger opened in 1757. In many ways, the world is still balancing it. History doesn't repeat, but its patterns echo, especially in the math. If this changed how you see the world, hit subscribe. History hides the answers. I'll show you where to find them. Dhaka, once a global center of fine muslin, became a shadow of its former self.